Thank you all for coming. Um, the word healing is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word halen, meaning to make whole, sound, and well. Historically, healing environments were embedded with love, compassion, trust, and empathy. And they focus on healing, not just the mind, body, but the spirit as well. We are at a crossroads. The world has gone through a dramatic paradigm shift over the last several years and has reached a potential tipping point. Our climate is changing, and people are facing ever more difficult threats to food sources and their livelihoods. Our societies are waking up to the notion that all people are created equal have been words, not deeds. Our collective experience of trauma, loss, and isolation from a devastating pandemic has made significant impact on our physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. How do we make ourselves sound and well? How do we help each other become whole, sound, and well? Today, we will discuss historically how architecture has been used to bring people together to focus on healing, since individuals heal best with an integrative approach to well-being that involves family, friends, social support, and community. When we add medical and behavioral health providers, as well as spiritual guidance, the ability for individuals to heal expands exponentially. I'm an architect who leads a studio based in Chicago. For many years, I have collaborated with multidisciplinary teams to develop healing environments as tools for integrative healing programming for trauma, loss, and chronic disease. Each design we create is process-driven, and we involve people from affected communities in conjunction with teams and appropriate subject matter experts, as well as focus groups ranging from kindergartners to Vietnam combat veterans. I will discuss historical examples of healing environments from Greek theater, the ancient healing city of Epidaurus, medieval Japanese tea gardens, and 2 Italian contemporary cemeteries. I will then show examples of how we built upon these historical contexts for specific designs in a variety of communities and contexts, from DeSable High School Urban Ecology Sanctuary Project, the Green Road Project at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, and the Cedar Rapids Veterans Memorial Building. I will then discuss how we worked with the National Institutes of Health to create the Department of Veterans Affairs Healing Environment Design Guideline for the healing of the mind, body, and spirit for 9 million veterans and their families. We'll highlight these guiding principles that can be used not only for hospitals, but for the variety of important contexts, including schools, community centers, mental health centers, and even correctional facilities. My partner Sam will then talk a bit more about the science of healing and how apps and programs have proliferated over the last several years in the digital space. He will then discuss our work as we seek to tie all of this together to create a better future and further our goal of positively affecting 100 million lives. First slide, please, Sam. So it's interesting, again, when we think about aesthetics, people always think it's something that it's about looks, but it's actually about feeling. Next. Again, Greek theater. Greek theater was not just for entertainment, it was for public catharsis. The theater was a healing tool, and Greece was involved in centuries of warfare. All their population was affected, unlike today where 1% of the population is involved in the military. In Greece, it was 100%. Again, either families supporting active military or veterans. Alcinius Alcinous, Sophocles, and Euripides were veterans. The cast was veteran, and the audience was veteran or active military. Next slide, please. Epidaurus, which was founded about 500 BCE, was actually one of several Greek healing cities in the Mediterranean. And it catered to the entire Mediterranean region, not just Greece. And it was a city devoted, again, to healing. It was Asclepian medicine, which was purely mind and spirit that would hopefully affect the wellness of the body. There was no scientific methods at this point. Sam, if you could point to that circular element. So the healing took place in the temples, where the priests would work with those who were sick, and they would do prayers. They would do sort of these sleeping incubations, where they would literally wrap up somebody who was ill, be with them during the night, and unwrap them in the morning. And this sort of incubation was sort of the return to the womb. As you see the rest of the buildings around, there was number 3 in the upper right-hand corner was the actual hospital where those who were very ill stayed. There was baths. There was a banquet hall. And then there was number 30 was actually a stadium. So they went and watched games. And this was, again, all part of the healing regimen. It wasn't just in the temple, but it was the preparation. It was the decompression afterwards. And I love this quote, because again, you must enter with positivity. Next. Again, as time went on and Hippocrates arrived on the scene, there was a combination of both the healing, the sort of the healing Asclepian method of mind, spirit, and body, with, again, scientific sort of discoveries. You know, medicines were starting to be developed, but they didn't lose sight of the importance of the mind and the spirit. Next. And of course, the Epidaurus Theater, which still is in existence, and this is a photo of it, they still have Greek plays here. It seats 3,000 people. No microphones, no speakers. You'll sit at that top row and you'll hear with a crystal precision of whatever the performance is. But again, the idea of theater as a healing tool, of creating this sort of collective experience, as well as seeing plays that begin to talk about mental health issues or struggles. It creates an empathy, a compassion that all 3,000 people will experience. Next. So I want to take you to the Japanese tea gardens, which again was another major influence in our projects. This is the Golden Temple. Japanese tea gardens have been evolving for over 1,000 years. These coupled with the Zen tea ritual, communal activities, and allegorical theme, metaphors and symbols initiate a transcending of the state of being. And it creates within its, again, series of experiences, just like Epidaurus, clarity and well-being. Next, please. And this is the view of the interior courtyard of Rohanji. Again, another temple in Kyoto. This is about 1488. What is not as well known is in the wake of, and this is from the book, An Introduction to Japanese Tea Ritual, in the wake of the civil wars, what preceded the Kamakura period, 1185 to 1392, the samurai came to power and had a wide influence in Japan. The Zen-based tea ritual became a healing tool for samurai warriors, dealing with the aftermath of battle, as well as moments of contemplating their own mortality. Again, it's about that sort of transcendence, that sort of distilling of meaning from loss. Because again, as a warrior, you lose many comrades in battle. You've killed people. Next. And this shows, again, it's not a singular experience. These pavilions, some are for communal gathering, for banquets, similar to Epidaurus, for restoration, baths. Next, please. And then there's the metaphorical part, and these are the stone gardens. And again, these gardens, which again, you're seeing the metaphor of the islands, in a sea. These don't stay the same, these change. And again, it's understanding and realizing that, as we change, as people, as the seasons change, this exhibit changes. And again, it goes into a whole series of metaphors and again, allegory. Next. So, part of this, of course, it's a personal journey. So when I was in my 20s, I lost a very good friend. She was 19. She died in a car accident. I also lost an amazing friend. She was 31. She died of cystic fibrosis. And I turned my graduate work at Syracuse University when I was in Italy, in Florence, into kind of it was a personal journey of mourning. And that was in 1991 when I did the program in Italy. And when I came back, I came to Chicago, and I realized the material that I had was, which I'm going to show a little bit of it to you in the following slides. I was trying to understand how the architecture became a tool for the resolution of loss. And I immediately started seeking university professors and their work to help understand this. I didn't want to go back into architecture. I just had too much stuff that I had to synthesize. So long story short, I called down at the University of Chicago at the Divinity School at the recommendation of a professor at the seminary school at Northwestern. And I asked him, I said, do you have anyone who does mourning? And the secretary who ended up being my secretary said, yes, Peter Homans. He just finished a book called The Ability to Mourn. And I said, well, this is what I do. Have him call me back, please. And I'm very polite. I always said, please. And thinking, and then my last comment was, well, and how long has he been there? And she said 30 years. And I distinctly remember hanging up thinking, yeah, right, he's going to call me back. Well, he called me back the next day. Long story short, he asked me to teach PhD candidates at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. And this is, again, Homans' theory of the archetype of mourning. It's a process. Everyone, many people think that mourning is just grief, which is the roller coaster of emotions. It is something in which we will all experience as we lose important things in our life. People as well as ideals. But what Holman's said is he's literally the acceptance or denial, the fork in the road, is a critical phase. And again, we may go right, we may go left, we may go into denial for a while, we may come back into acceptance. When we do,
We're very rich.
we transform. We transform, meaning our values and our beliefs change. So we come to the realization that it's different, now is different than it was before. I was very interested in post 9/11, when many of those who were in the financial companies in the towers, the survivors, they left finance and they went to become social workers, become teachers. And what's interesting in Holman's theory, the transitional objects. Again, a tomb is a place, a sacred place of memory. It's a sacred place of, these are the remains of my loved one. And it forces you to focus on the issue of loss. But it's also that sort of transitional object that brings the past, present, and future together. And then, so his last part is if who you are changes, then what you do is different than what you did before. And the World Trade Center was an example of that. Next, please. So my studies, again, was the architecture, but it was the people in the architecture. And this is quite an extensive collection. I'm just showing you a few slides of different circumstances. I was with a telephoto lens. I was trying to be as respectful as I could be. But I was trying to understand something that was very important. So this is a small town outside of Pisa. This gentleman is visiting his wife, who passed 2 years beforehand. He's in what I observed to be sort of the existential dialogue. And when you talk to Italians who do go and mourn there, and I didn't talk to any of the people I filmed, but what they'll say is they'll be at the tomb and they'll be talking or thinking through a story of their daughter, their son, that's in the present, about a problem, about trying to understand what she, the mother who passed, would say. And that would then begin to address the issue of the daughter, of the son. Next. So this young man was visiting the tomb actually to the left, with the black marble. These were very recent deaths within weeks. And when, of course, the shock of death, the shock of losing a loved one, it's not so easy just always to go to that tomb. And what he stood there probably for 10 minutes. He didn't move an inch. It's kind of that, in a way, the fork in the road, in the sense of confronting the loss. And the tomb helped him confront the loss. Next. And then he engaged in precisely, it's hard to say what he engaged in, but again, the time spent there helped him process. Next. And of course, in Italian cemeteries, and again, these are typically in small towns where every Saturday and Sunday, the community goes there. And the socialization the mourning of with the grandmother, with the grandchildren, it's not to fear things. It's not to be afraid. It's to embrace. It's to nurture. It's to nurture the tombs uh, as they took care of someone in life. Next. So this comes to a project that I've been to at least 10 times. I got a grant for a book for this particular cemetery. It's the Brion Cemetery in San Vito de Altivile by Carlos Scarpa. And where I've identified the allegory, the metaphor, the symbols, and even how the architectural syntax correlates with the literary syntax of particular literature. And I have worked with the assistant of the architect, the son, and a very famous historian named Kenneth Frampton, contemporary architecture historian at Columbia. And they all seem to think I got it. I just got to get it together and publish it. But what you see here, Sam, in the center is the actual Brion Cemetery. Surrounding it is an agricultural field. To the left is the town, the small town of San Vito de Altivile. And then to the left are the foothills of the Alps. This is basically the place where the Italians fought the Austro-Hungarians during World War I, about 2 million casualties. This was very near where Hemingway worked for the Red Cross and was wounded. Giuseppe Brion was sort of the Sony of Italy after World War II, where he developed television sets and radios. Next. So I'm going to take you for a very quick tour, and we'll start down at number 2. So you enter into essentially the village cemetery. These are the neighbors of Giuseppe Brion. You look to the left, you see number 5 is actually the tomb of the architect, Carlos Scarpa. His was the first burial at the tomb. You come through number 8, which is the propylaeum, the gate. Number 9 is the portico. To the right is number 11 is the pondering pavilion. As you go back to the left, this is the green area, is the gazan. This is the tomb of the mother and the father. Number 22 is the tomb of the family members, such as the grandfather. And then, as you see, number 26 down here is the chapel. And then number 29 is the priest cemetery. Next, please. So again, as you enter the tomb, you see the propylaeum. Next, please. Again, as you come towards it, you see that there's these 2 intertwined circles. You see the gazan and the boundary wall of the cemetery next. And the 2 intertwined circles. Red is fire, blue symbolizes water, purification, symbols of purification, especially in Rome, Greek and Roman traditions. Next. And it's interesting, again, another symbol, Vesia Pisces, which is talking about, the realms of sort of consciousness. Again, this could have also influenced Carlos Scarpa, probably very much so. Next. The tomb of the mother and father, this is called the Arcosolium. It also has the proportions of Venetian bridges. And you see the town of San Vito de Altivile and the Alps and the family tomb to the left. Next. Giuseppe Brion. And that's beautiful Venetian Murano glass. Scarpa was also worked in Murano right after he almost finished architecture school. Next. A view of actually towards the pondering pavilion, the portico from which you entered. And then you see there's actually a natural spring that water is literally below. And that flows into where the pondering pavilion is, with the pool next. And it's interesting when all of a sudden a tour bus arrives, it changes the mood significantly. It's become a very popular place in Treviso, or I'm sorry, Veneto, to visit. Next. An interior view showing the altar, the chapel next. And yes, that was me many moons ago in the Pondering Pavilion. I got to know the caretaker very well. He opened it all up for me. It was amazing. Next. A view as you're in that Pondering Pavilion, looking towards the Arcosolium and the lily pond and the pool next. And as you sit down, the panorama sort of speaks to itself. I've been in this cemetery from morning to moonlight. I spent 7 days in a row here. I met so many amazing people. Next. So coming to Chicago, and literally just starting to teach at the University of Chicago at the Divinity School, this happened. This was the shooting of Dontrell Davis at Cabrini Green, where he was walking from his home to the school, holding the hand of his mother, when he was shot through the head by a sniper in a gang war. I couldn't, and this, you're talking about, you know, a situation I just couldn't process. I didn't understand. I'm new to Chicago. I didn't understand the whole dynamics of the housing projects. And this ended up becoming a big part of my life, which at the time, I thought I was going towards academia next. And that happened literally after teaching at the University of Chicago, getting a grant for a book for the Brionne Cemetery. I was actually working with the Art Institute educational program. Ronnie Hartfield brought 10 architects together to work with 60 kids from DuSable High School. The stories I was hearing from the kids, and the purpose of the workshops was how to redecorate your neighborhood. Like, by the end of these 6 sessions, it was really how to redecorate your war zone. And Ronnie asked me to go there a year later. This was about 1993. And to present to the kids, to get a bunch of students there next year. And I went down on the 29 South State Street bus with the sole thought of, I have to wait on that bus stop by myself to get back. And I was not happy. And after the presentation to these 30 kids, Connie Montgomery, an assistant principal, came up to me and said, do you know what we need around here? And I said, in my mind, like everything? And she said, we need a space for conflict resolution. A lot of children are being murdered here. She led me to what you'll see on the right side is the Robert Taylor homes. The black is DuSable High School, the first African-American school created for the African-American community. And in the center was our project, but at the time when I walked in, there was peacocks, ducks, geese, chickens, and a goat named Miss Daisy. And Connie Montgomery said, she said, Dr. Hamberlin has been trying to do something with this courtyard for 30 years. And I walked in looking at these exotic birds, and I don't know what I was thinking. It was kind of like an epiphany, though. It was kind of like a search for my meaning, dedicated to the losses of my friends. And I said, sure, let's try something. Next. And it was a situation that was beyond anything I've ever come across or could even process next. Where children were not children. And so damage. So again, over 50% of my kids witnessed a murder. A third were physically or sexually assaulted. Over 70% knew someone who was murdered. And I worked with over 800 kids in the course of 7 years. Next. Dr. Hamberlin was born on a former plantation in Vicksburg, Mississippi. He came to Chicago in 1960. He was a horticulture biology teacher. He brought his farm to DeSable High School, where not only did he teach horticulture and biology, but he taught them the lessons of life and how to nurture life. He was a 2-time Golden Apple Award winner. Next. I really didn't understand everything that was happening here. I heard Carl Bell, the first child psychiatrist to identify the Vietnam War syndrome with what children were experiencing on the south side of Chicago. Carl passed a year ago, and was an amazing individual. Next. I brought Peter Homans there. He talked about his mourning theory. What he said after this workshop, he said that these students had a more profound understanding and sounded like poets, and a more profound understanding of mourning than the PhDs we taught at the Divinity School. Next. So this was the result of working with 11 students. Very quickly, at the bottom part of the project is a area, the forecourt, to allow kids just to talk, to visit. You have a gateway, similar, and you'll start to see some Japanese tea garden in that. So at this position, you have choices. We give you all sorts of choices. You can sort of meander through the project, or you take this sort of rigid path. In the center is the classroom, peer-to-peer support pavilion, year-round access. To the right, this curvilinear element is a promenade with a bell tower for ritual, for celebrating graduations, basketball victories, for mourning. To the left, in the upper left corner, is a commemorative space to the murdered children, with a table of memory, with a wall with the names of the murdered, with stones of thoughts. You cross a bridge, a pathway, and you come to a picnic area. And then 3 rooms of contemplation. Again, this came from the kids, the teachers, ideas, thoughts. A room of contemplation, you might ask, what does a teenager need that for? And one kid said, if I just had a place that I could get my head together after something happened, maybe I wouldn't go out and hurt someone. Next. So the project, the Taylor homes went down. We raised some money. It wasn't enough money. The city wasn't going to invest into a school that was depopulating. It failed to build. It got published, got presented to the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies. And then I took that model, I took that paper. I was invited to, at the time, Bethesda Naval Military Medical Center, which is now Walter Reed. And I was invited to be on a think tank called the Epidaurus Project, which was the most amazing collection of medical providers, behavioral health experts, researchers that the United States had to offer for the purpose of understanding and to create treatments and environments for the healing of post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and major depression for active military who were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this wasn't because DOD became touchy-feely. This was because they were, and this was 2007, they were afraid they couldn't field enough combat-ready units. PTSD was rampant. So this think tank, again, and this is where I met Ann Berger, the chief of pain and palliative medicine at NIH, who we've collaborated over 13 years. But this just shows the Green Road project that was implemented. We were part of the master plan. We created these pavilions. The pavilions, unfortunately, were value engineered out, but still there was these platforms for commemoration and for peer support. Next. And I'm going to hurry up here. So this also led to the creation of the Cedar Rapids Veterans Memorial Building, in which this was our first commission in 2010. And you see up here, you see a massive, this is the massive flood that happened in 2008. 7,000 people went homeless, 1,000 city blocks went under. So essentially, we were given the whole building to both restore historic spaces, but to introduce therapeutic spaces and community building spaces. Next. So I'm just kind of showing you just sort of the array. It went from everything to your left, creating conference rooms that ended up being rooms of solitude, of therapy, of one-to-one therapy. You'll see these objects in these sort of niches, which I'll show you later. Iowa Writers Workshops, University of Iowa Writer Workshops, worked with veterans on writing their stories as a means of therapy. Performances, communal events from boxing to dinners. You know, again, the sort of Epidaurus thing. Next. And this project in the memorial room has a very one of a kind. It's Grant Wood's only painted stained glass window. He was a World War I veteran ready to deploy to France when the war stopped. He was painting essentially tanks and planes. But what you see here is it's actually his sister, who was his favorite model, and was soldiers from the Revolution to World War I. I stood in this room for 5 years, and I could never get enough. Next. And this just shows the extent of the project from a complete, again, either restoration or redo of 120,000 square feet, which is the building to the left, to a redesign of the public green on top, to the restoration of a 126-car garage. It took 2 years to design, 2 years to build, and it's up and running. Next. And this just shows the befores and afters. So on the left, that was after the flood. On the right, again, bringing natural light in, creating, again, restoring the historical aspects of it. Next. Where now it's become a place of communal activities. From the Iowa Women's Gymnastic Championships to performances to presentations. It's become, again, a center of activity in Cedar Rapids. Next. Before and after, this was on the left was the armory, on the right. This is our redesign where you see a stage in the center. On the left were the therapeutic rooms. On the second floor below was place for serving food. On the right were locker rooms, and then above that was a gym for physical health. Next. And then above on the 6th floor was an artist, a veteran artist studio. And believe me, there's much more better pictures than this, but an incredible place for families and veterans in the community. Next. And again, just shows you different views of corridors. That's Mike Jagger, who led the effort for the Cedar Rapids Veterans Memorial Building. An amazing client. Next. And again, befores and afters, where conference rooms become therapeutic rooms for writers, Iowa writers workshops. We see the niches were designed there to create a place for objects. It also gave them a sense people went before them who also suffered and also healed. Next. Again, just another close-up of that. Next. And then we created a restaurant. Never designed a restaurant before. This also became a place for peer support. Next. And as we're wrapping up so Sam can get going, all this culminated in what is the Department of Veterans Affairs Healing Environment Design Guideline, an unprecedented document. I had 39 subject matter experts, 23 veterans. Ann Berger was part of this, who did the research part of the chapter, in which we will measure healing efficacy in space. That's never been done before, using Ann's methods. Next. And again, we start the sort of chapter with what is a healing environment. You see Lurie there. We looked at many hospitals. Lurie is an amazing hospital, very thoughtful design. Next. And we created 7 healing environment design principles. Again, this can be applied to any civilian project. Next. And we created diagrams. This is not a final design, but it shows you that, again, coupled with healing programming, you can create a narrative of healing. So in that upper left-hand side, this is the reception lobby area. As you go to the right to the perimeter, you see a mental health clinic opening up to that courtyard. As you continue on the perimeter at that lower right-hand side, there's a chapel. As you continue further right to the perimeter, are contemplative rooms. In the center is the courtyard, and that upper portion where that pavilion is peer-to-peer support. And the down right side here is a contemplative pavilion. And then there's a place you can go have lunch and dinner. So again, Epidaurus. So I'd like to hand it over to Sam. Sorry this took so long.
No, that was perfect, Paul. Thank you. It's funny. It was interesting to me how in the Cedar Rapids, what was the armory before, where they stored munitions and weapons and implements of destruction, suddenly became this place where people could commune together and community could come together, and there were contemplative spaces. It's fascinating how you turned a room of war into a room of peace and healing. It's amazing kind of how you pull it all through with the healing guidelines as well. And it's interesting because, Paul had mentioned historically what's been happening for millennia and what humans have done to create these healing environments. And then Ann Berger, as Paul mentioned, the chief of pain and palliative medicine at the NIH, has studied. She found that healing spaces have to provide 3 main components in order to create this idea of healing. The first is connection. And it's connection in a variety of ways. One is with the community, and another is with religion, because many people are religious. But it's not just religion, it's also spirituality. It's this idea of connection with higher power. We're a piece of something greater than us. So it's funny because she was even giving a speech recently, and someone said, well, wait a minute, can't you help atheists? And I said, well, no, it's definitely part of just that idea of you're one of many things. You're just a part of a bigger whole. So it's not just religion. And it's also support from family and friends, because it's very hard to heal if you feel isolated. And another aspect of healing that healing spaces have to help convey and provide succor for is reflection and introspection. So being surrounded by nature, as an example, you look historically at all these different, I want to say projects, but cities and towns and contemplative and healing spaces. They have views of nature, there's natural light, there's something that we've all known forever, and yet we build these enormous buildings and places of curing that aren't necessarily spaces of healing anymore. And so the spaces have to be able to help others and allow you to be present in whatever you're feeling, because that allows you to engage in activities that involve mind and body. And then in a lot of what they've found in the surveys that they went through with people who've had cancer and faced other life-threatening illnesses, is that allows them to working through grief has brought meaning to their life and allowed them to live with passion and purpose, which we know is incredibly important. And then the healing spaces have to create trust and acceptance. So bringing this idea of peace and calm to your life and calmness in general, and then this idea that there's confidence in your caregivers, whether those caregivers are your medical professionals or your family and friends and support groups. So all of these things coming together are involved in everything that Paul has done to create these healing spaces. And the NIH has studied to say these are absolutely allowing for a number of different aspects of healing, from shorter hospital stays to feeling more whole and having sense of purpose and fulfilled. And part of what they did is they had this, one of the things that the NIH is trying to solve for is the opioid crisis. And so they have the NIH HEAL scale, and the HEAL scale is all about healing in the opioid crisis long term. And so what they found is that trauma, resilience, and mindfulness, many people have had this history of this, they're relevant factors in experience healing, because it makes people realize they want to make the most of their lives. You know, if you think about people who are dying, they never say, oh, I wish I had worked more. I wish I had been in isolation more. It's all about connection and better relationships, being more present. And then again, that idea of working through grief has brought meaning to their lives. And then they even asked, well, what does healing mean? And one, of course, is overcoming illness. But the other two that are really important, even more important, is this idea of having hope. And of all the questions I've asked, I told you that I have hope that with my God, all will be well. And surrendering to this idea of something greater than all of us. Spiritual healing is very good because it allows for believing that God is in control of everything instead of wondering. It'd be good for everyone to come to God for spiritual healing. So it's whether or not the idea of believing in God isn't as important as this idea of being whole and connecting to that spirituality. And it's interesting because as Paul and I were working together, and I'll tell you the story about that in a little bit, but we were chatting with Ann Berger because we were talking about healing. She said, well, you haven't defined healing. What's the difference between curing and healing? Because a lot of people go and they want to be cured. And yet it's fascinating. You look at the language of curing, and many health practitioners, they focus on this idea of cure, but the language is reasonably negative. It's an eradication of disease or a banishment of illness. And you have to think through the side effects. And is there a sacrifice? And is that worth the sacrifice? And eliminating these disruptors as opposed to healing, which is all about becoming whole or providing comfort and relieving suffering and providing a path to peace. And they all involve this idea of mind, body, and spirit. And again, the NIH has been studying this. And so that triumvirate is incredibly important for healing. And healing enhancers in physical spaces absolutely increase the ability to heal. So it's focus on the healing instead of distracting from healing and creating that connection between mind, body, and spirit. I'll mention a few more times and beat that dead horse. But it also creates this idea of connection for social support networks and community, because it's hard to heal alone. And this idea of shared experience, so we can get over trauma and grief and whatever we're facing, it's much more powerful when we can do that together. So Paul and I were chatting last year. Paul and I have been friends for about 30 years. And he was talking about how because of COVID, some of his projects have been put on hold for a little bit. And I said, well, Paul, I know you've been focusing on these healing environments forever. Why haven't you made them digital? And that way, it allow more people to have access to them. And you no longer have to be beholden to the laws of physics even, right? You can create anything in this virtual environment and think through what those healing environments would do if people were allowed to have access to them 24/7 from any device, anytime, anywhere, in order to help with their healing. And that started this new journey that Paul and I started working on with our pal Greg, who's on the phone. And I want to take a step back because it's interesting how things have changed over time. Right, the fourth industrial revolution that we're in now has really changed things quite a bit. From the 1700s that allowed for the industrial revolution, things to be created and you could travel a little bit more, to the 1800s, where that was the first industrial revolution. In the 1700s, things were created and they had little factories, to electricity and the creation of goods and travel and new supply chains, to the third industrial revolution in the 1900s, where it was more about faster supply chains, getting things more quickly in the hands of others. So it was steam and commodities to electric and goods, and then suddenly it was the latter half of the 1900s, obviously, about computing and services, and allowed for more alacrity. To today, the fourth industrial revolution is all about what folks are calling intelligence, which is, you can argue whether or not it's really that intelligent, but all about analytics and deep data and insights, but more about experience and how that immediacy and expectation has changed. Where if you think about disruption innovation, people expect things sooner, better, the way they want it now. So if you're online, if most of us have tablets or phones or something, or a wearable, we expect to be helped right now. If you send an email, you expect a response very quickly. If you send a text, you don't expect people to wait and send you a text in a day or a week. Most people expect that right now. And it's created that desire and need for speed. And then technology, if you think about smartphones and wearables, it's fascinating. Only the first smartphone was in 2007. And there was one group that came out with a report that said, oh, well, no one really wants a smartphone because, we have these devices that play music already. We have cameras and we have phones. Why would anybody want that combination? And now that'll only be good in places where there are poor people who need that combination. And then suddenly, of course, there's billions of smartphones today. But they've changed everything because we have access to information anytime, anywhere. Think about how people used to have arguments and discussions. And now you say, well, let me Google that. Like, I'm going to fix this now. We'll find out if you're right this second. To this idea of customer experience, because everyone wants to be delighted, whether it's in a business to consumer environment. As consumers, we all want the best customer experience. But even in the business to business space, this is changing. And also the health space. We're starting to want things different, immediate now. I want to be healed. So people are also getting more connected, which is pretty fascinating. From connected scales and wearables, right? We've got an Apple Watch here, to an Aria scale and how they can interact together, or a Fitbit. I'm wearing a wearable right now so I can track my steps and it reminds me to stop being so lazy. To connected shoes that are running, to robots, to you no longer need a room key for your hotel. You can just use your phone. To streaming devices, I can be in my room watching a movie, and then I pause the movie and I pick up my tablet and it continues on the tablet as I walk. And then if I go somewhere else, I can continue it on my phone. Or, it's astounding. And we can all sort of lament this idea, but it's created this odd sense of continuity in our lives. And especially as younger people get more connected to, having Amazon Echoes in every single room of the house. Sadly, I'm guilty of that. And then even connecting your cars. So all of our lives are connected into you can say a miasma, but there's a lot of data out there and it can be used for good or ill. The data itself isn't immoral or amoral. It's just data. It's how we use it, what we can do with it in very productive or dysfunctional ways. But it's interesting how everything is getting more connected too. If you think way back in the 60s, there were mainframe terminals, there were about 100,000 of them. To then about the 80s, there were client servers, there became 10 million of them, which turned into the cloud and an integration of mobility and social aspects of how we all connect with one another. Many of us on this call have either Instagram or Facebook or Etsy or Pinterest or watch YouTube, and this will probably be put on YouTube as an example. So, and Twitter. It's fascinating how it all comes together, and there's now 9 billion or more mobile phones which are connected to 90 billion smart things. It's pretty incredible what we can do as we move from mobile to the Internet of Things to AI. And it's daunting and fascinating all at the same time to think through, well, how does this have to do with healing and digital, and what can we do with this? So it's interesting because Paul and I and Greg were chatting for quite some time about this. Our individual and communal well-being is at risk like never before, right? Especially with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, where there are a lot of companies who have what's called hoteling, where you don't go to the office necessarily unless you need to go to an office because you're traveling, you go to a client site. So many people are traveling around to go to do their work, and they're not necessarily co-located. You know, one of the companies I worked for many years ago, I had a number of people reporting to me from India. And so I'd have to, you know, figure out time differences, and we'd get on what was called telepresence at the time because there was no Zoom. And we'd have to figure out how to make sure we were connecting face to face or travel from India to the States or vice versa. But we have this isolation and alienation right now, which is really pretty challenging, as well as loss. Many people have faced loss, not only in the pandemic, but in our lives in general, as Paul was talking about. And that loss has often created a loss of purpose. And we know that there's comorbidities between mental health issues and physical health issues. So suddenly that loss of purpose can create these physical health ailments. And, you know, as just talked about, the NIH is very concerned about the opioid crisis and addiction in general, because it's so dysfunctional and creates a number of ancillary negative effects to our society. And there's a lot of articles lately all about how this is creating this idea of languishing, that people aren't necessarily engaging in productive activities. Because if you think about all the stuff we just talked about, even in the fourth industrial revolution, it can create confusion. It's the plethora of choice is not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes too much choice can lead to negative actions and behaviors. And we also know that people are lonely and disconnected. More than 111 million people in the US alone are facing mental health issues, from depression to anxiety and stress and PTSD and suicidal ideation. It's becoming this parallel pandemic that's happened over the last year and a half. And of course, people aren't sure how to get the personalized help they need. So COVID, the silver lining to COVID, it's shining a spotlight on some of the needs and gaps of healthcare, because many hospitals and organizations aren't necessarily set up in a way that help people. They're helping cure a body with symptoms, and how we can really start thinking of whole person care and how the person can be the center of healing and work backwards from what they're trying to achieve. And some hospital groups have been doing that, but many have not. But there's piecemeal virtual help. You know, if you want to help in today, you know, social media, we found actually increases anxiety. People who, I mean, think about over the last year, if any of you have gotten into an argument on Facebook with a stranger, right? That's increased anxiety. I have absolutely done that because I'm an idiot. But like, why did I engage? Right? It's one of those things where it just increases stress levels. And they're great audio-based meditation apps as one example, and they're phenomenal. They do a really good job of increasing mindfulness. And yet, how does that figure into a whole person integrative care? And then physical spaces are often highly inadequate. Most healing spaces, healing in quotes, don't necessarily have those healing enhancers that we've talked about. They don't provide comfort for healing. I think that's an actual waiting room for a hospital. That's not calming or healing, or that's anxiety producing. And then there's little personalization. You know, one person's healing is not another person's healing. So how do we make sure we're doing this for us? And, you know, in marketing literature, they talk a lot about microsegmentation analytics. There's so much data out there. Companies can very quickly figure out who you are and track you, and then provide you with what they think is a very quick choice to get you to buy something. But if you think about how we figure that out for healing, we haven't caught up yet. And people are different. They don't respond to the same treatments the same way. So how do we figure out how to individualize that, integrate it together, and create whole person care? That is absolutely the future. So it's fascinating, though, as an aside, there's over $509 billion being spent on the digital health market today, right? From wearables to devices to other technologies. And the mobile health market of that is about $230 billion. It's astronomical amounts of money and growing at incredible rates. And this is all even pre-COVID. But the apps segment is growing at almost 40%. But I want to take a step sideways too, because how many of us have been in a waiting room? It's fascinating because some of you, I know Barbara obviously was very good friends with my stepfather, and he had cancer. And going with him, my mom and I would go with him to chemo every week. And the waiting room, it was a very good hospital, but the waiting room was enclosed. It didn't have any windows. It had kind of lousy art. The furniture wasn't great or comfortable, very rigid chairs. And you just stared at each other, at other sick people, and it was not exactly a healing environment. And then let alone where we went for him to have his chemo. I'll talk about that in a minute. But even this, we're home alone and we're trying to get a telehealth visit, right? It's pretty stressful, right? Many people don't have their home set up as a healing environment. So how do we even fix that? Because where do you go if you want to heal? It's fascinating because in the Silicon Valley right now, there's some people who are trying to create an end-to-end solution to say, well, how do we make sure that you can create these community-enabled organizations and provide healing? If you think about it, when I was at one of my employers had a mental health room, and that mental health room used to be a closet. So what they did is they took a big closet and they put a recliner in there and a lamp and a sound wave machine. And like, okay, go in there for your mental healing, right? I mean, it was terrible. So they meant well, but same thing with the mother's breastfeeding room. Like, yeah, go in that place, dark, turn on the fluorescent lighting, go ahead. That's awesome, right? Very, very nurturing. So, but even before COVID, people started turning to these digital solutions. Some were audio only, right? It's Calm, Headspace, Happify, or they're really, really good. And there's some not-for-profits that are doing some amazing things. They're very useful. And they've had huge valuations. In fact, Calm and Headspace have been recently valued at more than $2 billion. But think about it, it's audio only. They're not personalized. So you can absolutely listen to Matthew McConaughey, for example, and he can talk you to sleep. It's very cool. All right. Go to sleep now. It's great. Very, very useful, but it's, kind of piecemeal in how you're putting it together, and you have to go select that and do that for yourself. And then when we want information and help for something you're facing, it's hard to find it. When you go online, and there's a number of wonderful blogs and communities and connections people crave, and they're on social support. And while we know that Instagram and Facebook make people more anxious, blogs do definitely fill a gap. They are out there, and you can absolutely connect with organizations. And some are doing some amazing things. Here in Chicago, for example, Immerman's Angels, Johnny Immerman had testicular cancer, and he was a young guy, never faced it. He couldn't find anybody who had faced it like him and could give him the advice of what he was going to face and what he was going to go through. So he created this amazing organization that's now national. I'm not sure if it's international yet. But it does a match.com where it'll match you with someone who can support you through your process, who has faced these similar issues. But it took, it took him years to build that because people are craving that support and that connection. And there's also telehealth and teleconferencing and telemedicine. It's funny because during the pandemic, through my insurance app, my daughter faced a couple things. She had, an eye issue, and then she had suddenly this round, would look like a rash, like, oh my gosh, we haven't been in the woods, but she had Lyme disease. So I, used my phone, logged in, and sure enough, a doctor was online like that, and looked at it and said, no, it's fine. Just do some hydrocortisone over her eye, prescribed some cream. It took 15 seconds, right? Really wonderful. But I didn't have a relationship with that doctor. Would never see that doctor again in that 15 seconds. So it was interesting, but don't know if that got in the way of productive relationships. But there are great things that are happening, right? Zoom and Google Hangouts and BetterHelp and Talkspace. So we can absolutely keep the therapy going in mental health and physical health, but it's not part of a whole integrated solution, right? It's us choosing to go do that when we need it. And we all have to be incredibly proactive. But if you think about it, if you've got mental health issues, that's really hard to be proactive because you're isolating yourself more and more and more. So how do we draw people out and even help them help themselves? And there are some VR, AR, virtual reality and augmented reality apps out there as well. Some that are very fascinating, pretty interesting. But some of them distract from healing. There's ones that are immersion therapy. So if you're afraid of spiders or heights, you can put on the goggles, and sure enough, you're facing these heights and spiders, and it's incredibly stressful. But they're piecemeal solutions. So we either have the single generalized issues, or distractions, and we have many that are facing multiple issues. And the challenge is to be everywhere is to be nowhere, as Seneca said. So how do we pull it all together? And one of the things that Paul and Greg and I are doing is figuring out together how we can be the hub of healing journeys. Like, where do your journeys start? Because people often don't know where to start if they need healing in some way. So what if we could help people focus on mind, body, and spirit in a way that's not just having to go to a physical environment, especially if one isn't built? So one of the interesting things of when Jack was getting his chemo, all of the chairs were recliners, and that was great, but they had windows, but none of the chairs faced the windows, especially because it was here in Chicago. And if they did look out the windows, you'd see a parking lot. So, how do you solve for that? And what if we could have healthcare providers put patients at ease before, during, and after their treatments? Or if we could create waiting rooms that were less stressful and create healing environments and personalize these healing journeys without having all this capital expenditure? Because as Paul has seen many, many times, there's no money, or the money dries up, or a hospital group may have just designed their space and they're not going to redesign it with the new healing environments or those healing principles in mind. So where do we start? And there are so many solutions out there. And we know, like I said, healing is a journey. We know also that most one-size-fits-all solutions don't necessarily work because we are all unique. And caregivers have been facing this for quite some time because they know that we have to focus on physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. But also often they focus on the individuals. They forget to include families, friends, social support networks, and community because it's hard to heal in isolation. And how do we personalize that care that also involves secular and non-secular aspects? What might help an atheist won't necessarily help a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew or a Muslim. And how do we incorporate all of that together and create these and both strategies where it's not an either or and you have to create these choices yourself and these trade-offs, but how do we create and integrate group support and help practitioners do this? And it's funny too, because we were thinking about, who needs the help, and it's where do we need to focus? And it's, again, this and both, because everybody needs the help. Individuals need that help. Families need help. Children in schools absolutely need help, as well as hospitals and healthcare providers. I don't know if you've read articles about what was happening in COVID, but doctors were understaffed, nurses were understaffed, physical healthcare providers were incredibly stressed. They were getting COVID. Some of them were dying, and they had no idea how to de-stress themselves. Plus organizations, companies, federal agencies, and how do we create this sense of community? So the great thing about technology today is that while it's daunting and all of these Amazon echoes are listening to every word I'm saying right now, it can absolutely use for positive outcome. And so there's Paul, Greg, and I, it's not just us, because we've been involving lots of organizations that'll talk about, from folks from Google to Goldman Sachs to the NIH to other organizations are coming together to help try and solve for this and revolutionize healthcare. Right? How do we use technology and data and analytics in a way that can create integrated whole person care and virtual healing so that we can improve healing efficacy and outcomes? Paul had mentioned that we're trying to positively affect more than 100 million people, but billions need the help. And it's I'm sure all of us know people who need some sort of help and don't necessarily know where to go, or they're not in the mindset to go do that. So we're increasing healing and reducing stress and alleviating anxiety, but that's not just us doing this. There's a lot of organizations and apps and companies trying to do it together. We're just trying to pull it all together in a way that makes the most sense. So very quickly, for the sake of time, one of the things we're doing is it's our platform. So I don't want to specifically make it about our platform. I want to more about the concept and why it's important for healing journeys to happen visually, not just from meditation apps. But one is we have yet to see anything that's using this idea of healing spaces from physical buildings to digital and focus on mind, body, and spirit. A lot of them are focused on mind and spirit or body, but not together, and have the NIH involved. Plus this idea of personalization, where you can have it in a way that's best for you. Can you still see my screen, by the way? I'm just making sure that, okay, great, thank you. So one of the things that we're doing, as Paul had mentioned, we're taking these virtual healing spaces, but if we can personalize them and make them make sense for you, imagine a place where instead of going to a physical space because we don't have it, it's all about how do we give people that personalization and ability to choose what makes sense for them. So being able to have a menu that says, well, what are my prevalent issues? What's my mood? What do I want to see? What do I want to hear? And then a journey would populate to say, okay, well, you said you're going to the doctor, you're getting chemo, you want a Chicago landscape, but that's where you live, and you want to see Greek mythology and inspirational verse and seascape and crashing waves. All of that is now possible. And then being able to study that over time, see, okay, people like you seem to like this journey. And the more we can help push you into ones that are more healing, all the better. But if you don't want that, you don't have to do that. And how can we create these spaces that make sense for everybody, that help mental health, physical health, and healing spaces together? Because as I mentioned, those comorbidities definitely exist. From the entire community, continuity and continuum of mental health issues, from grieving loss to addiction, which is incredibly important. And we're actually applying for several NIH grants right now to help with the opioid crisis. But it helps with everything. We know that the science is very clear. Once you apply these healing enhancers, you can absolutely help anybody to those comorbidities and help with your physical manifestations as well. And it's, you know, it's funny because people often wonder, well, what does this even look like? And how do you start the healing journey? And what is that? What can that become? So John is fictional John. We've got several of these user-based journeys where male in his early 30s has testicular cancer. He's got chemo, positive prognosis, but he's still worried about a number of issues. And he's worried about addiction too, because he's in a bunch of pain and he lives alone. So he heads to the doctor's office, and this is actually won't say which one. This is a waiting room that was recently redesigned, and it's online. That hospital group is touting how wonderful it is. You notice it's got fluorescent lighting, and it's no windows, and you're sort of facing each other looking at sick people. But the nurse can tell them, hey, pull up an app. It doesn't matter if it's this one, but there's a number of specific apps out there like Headspace or Calm, you know, at least guide you through meditation. And so John selects Chicago, Greek mythology, seaside, and waves, and he goes through his journey. And as he moves to the virtual journey to focus on healing, all of this is complementary to Headspace or Calm or selecting music. You know, we've even been chatting with a number of music providers. In fact, Barbara, I had a great chat with Salon about some of the music he has, and you know, be able to have this library of music to help with healing. And then stops his journey because he has to go start his chemo, and then he can start his chemo. And this is also a redesigned chemotherapy room that a hospital is touting. No windows, fluorescent lighting, great. They've got recliners. That's not healing. That's sort of, you know, everybody, it was funny because it was interesting too when I was, when my mom and I were with Jack, one of the things I noticed in the room where everyone was getting their chemo is that all the people getting chemo were distracting themselves. They're reading the newspaper, they're reading a book, maybe they were talking to somebody. They were all miserable, not focused on healing in any way, which isn't to say you have to sit there and, you know, manifest healing. But wouldn't it be great if at least you could see something that we know helps with healing for a short amount of time, and what that journey might have looked like had it been different. He probably still wouldn't have survived, but the journey would have been much more peaceful at the very least. And then he can start this new journey when he's doing his chemo, and he can do it after. This is just one of the many applications that we're doing it for. And so phase one has been complete. We're in phase two right now, but NIH is involved, veterans are involved. And as I mentioned, we've been consulting with a number of experts for a while, from the NIH to VA to Google to Stanford to Goldman Sachs, and folks coming together to figure out how to best use technology to create these healing environments that are complementary to everything out there, but provide people a path where right now we're not sure what to choose and what you need. Well, what if there was just one place to go and then you could get all of that together? And this is helping everybody from consumers to companies and universities. You think about right now where, I still teach at Northwestern, and we're getting these emails about what everyone going back to campus looks like. And there's a lot of stress and questions, whether people are vaccinated and can they mandate vaccines. And well, how do we provide at the very least a place for de-stressing at the university level, let alone when we think of things like sexual assault, where it's incredibly prevalent. Things are not just, at lots of universities, and it's underreported. It creates more stress. So everything that creates more stress, how do we provide something that's healing in conjunction with everything else that's going along with that? And providers, like mental and physical health providers, who can offer some tools and use it themselves for their own healing. Because it's fascinating. Someone I know very well right now is studying to be a SANE nurse. It's called a sexual assault nurse examiner. So when someone's sexual assaulted, they have to go and do all the examinations, which take 4 to 5 hours with somebody. But think of not only the stress of the person that's been affected, but the same nurse who has to keep doing that again and again and again and again and again. And that stress of seeing that. And even in their training, they say, hey, do not cry in front of the person. It's not your story. It's not your journey. Go excuse yourself and then go cry. But it's astounding. They don't have access to anything like this. And then insurance companies obviously involved too. And then we're creating a marketplace in our journey saying, hey, if you want a hub for, let's say I need yoga, or I want a primary care physician, or I want what's the best medical device out there? Well, one place to go get that. And then of course, data and benchmarks and analytics, doing it in a way that's a sort of member first philosophy where we don't know who you are. We don't know anything about you because we're not saving that, but how do we take that data and give it to people in the right way, whether it's for you as a consumer to say, hey, people like you, and answer a few questions. People like you seem to like this, but you don't have to do that, right? Sort of matching based on either your personality or your what you're facing, your age, where you're from, your religion, all of that coming together and say, hey, people like you we know you a little bit. People like you seem to like this, but you don't have to choose that. That's just one avenue. But again, focusing on that idea of more positive impact on whole person integrative care. So we're actually putting together our advisory board, and it's been phenomenal as we're talking to people from public schools, the VA, the NIH, businesses, providers. We're talking to doctors, people focused on wellness, healing, and mindfulness, and even startups. We've been talking to a number of organizations as well and partnering with them because they're very interested because they need these sorts of tools. There's a veterans group called Dry Hooch that helps veterans with PTSD and mental health issues as well as addiction. There's an organization called Above and Beyond that helps those who are homeless, who also have addiction issues. And we're starting to collaborate with, our plans are also to collaborate with folks like Inner Explorer that brings mindfulness to kids. And they've been helping 2 million children a year and growing with mindfulness practice and reading scores going up, math scores going up, behavioral disturbances going down, helping with public schools, other tech companies. And we're creating the journeys and obviously focusing more and more on the dev and the platform so that more and more people can be helped. This is us. You don't need to see us. You know who we are by now. Greg, by the way, who's on the call, is our chief legal counsel, who's been helping with quite a bit behind the scenes. But that's it. We wanted to give you a sense of, one is the history behind healing spaces, how healing spaces are now going online, and more importantly about how technology can actually help us instead of hinder us from getting that healing, and some of the paths forward that are out there. But it's amazing how much research has been done, but yet people not taking that research to make it digital, even though digital is some of the first places that people go to get the help. So thank you. Any questions? Any comments? Any concerns?
Let's go back to get rid of this. How do I there we go. There you are. Hello all. That was phenomenal. And thank you.
Thank you.
Betty, you.
Good.
Hmm.
I was just gonna say it was
Are-
fascinating how Paul
I
and
had
I had
just
been
resting
chatting.
on my hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Are you in or are you out, Betty?
I'm in, but I'm not raising my hand. I'm
Oh.
just resting my head.
Oh,
So I thought you were trying to say something. It's funny because I said Paul and I have been friends for 30 years, and we'd always been looking for something to collaborate on. And it's fascinating it took this long to kind of have the confluence of a lot of silver. I hate to say this, but oddly, COVID I think has really helped a lot of people in a variety of ways, where we're seeing this silver lining of loss and grief, and now what are those gaps, and how can we hockey stick that help in a way that wasn't possible before, where before it was just, luckily we're, folks
well,
getting,
it also stripped away the non-essential.
exactly, absolutely, where, Alexander.
Hi, thank you very much. That's really interesting. I was just wondering about the cultural aspect of this. Through your travels, have you been to places where you think they kind of generally, this is a generalized question, but where they seem to handle mourning, or in a kind of more kind of holistic way, or even thinking particularly about the hospital waiting rooms. It's obviously not simply a matter of finance, it's a matter of culture as well, just kind of how people come together and how that experience is mapped out. So I was just wondering whether there are other places you've been to that seem to kind of deal with that better.
From the standpoint of mourning, I mean, Italians and Greeks, I mean, it's not a separate issue. It's very integrated into their culture, their literature, their performance. It's part of their lives. It's not. It gets back to what Sam kept on saying. It's not either or. It's and or both. And it's very healthy. In the bigger cities, those cemeteries are empty. So why that is, it's probably for many reasons.
I can see that for mourning. I can see that for mourning, but I was just wondering, if you're going to a kind of mid-sized Italian medical facilities and people were in a waiting room waiting for their chemo, would that be mapped out in a different way?
No, but well, and first of all, I haven't toured. I toured for the guideline 9 VA, 3 Defense Department, and about 10 private hospitals all around the U.S. Okay. Mm-hmm. I can't really comment other than from when I lived in Italy for 2 years and when I was studying. The public hospitals are in bad shape. Private hospitals are better. I mean, aesthetically, right? But other than that, I can't comment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Interesting too, because if you look at other countries, think about the UK, think about India, most places of curing are set up where the person going in who's got some sort of symptoms, they don't necessarily get the lab work done at the same place. So like, you go to the doctor says, this is what's wrong with you, but go over there to go get the lab work done. Go to this other place, go make another appointment. It's not set up, none of these are set up in a way that makes it easy for a user, right, an end user, the person who needs the whole person integrated care. None of them are really set up in a way that makes sense. None is a very strong word, because there are some places that are absolutely doing this. But one of the people with whom we spoke was talking about how she is trying to help. She's from India, and she's trying to help people in India deal with these issues, especially as COVID is going rampant and people are dying. It's very underreported how much people are dying, and the hospital groups are overwhelmed. They've run out of oxygen, but they face the same issues where they've got either deteriorating mental or physical spaces, let alone the hospitals not being set up in a way that are healing. All there are is, like, you think about it, you build a space, you need to give people some sort of treatment, and they've thought about it that way, not as in, so it's the body with symptoms that we've talked about. Most of them aren't set up in a way either thinking about physical aesthetics, let alone healing as we're talking about it here with this idea of whole person care.
And
Yeah,
I want to add to that, you know, the best hospitals that I've been in that exhibited really healing environment concepts were Defense Department hospitals. So it was Camp Pendleton in California, Fort Belvoir outside of DC. Really took a lot of the, you know, positive healing environment ideas and incorporated it into their structures. Lurie was amazing, I think, very, very good. But I've also been in extremely expensive hospitals, some local, some out in California. They spent a lot of money wasting it on big lobbies, a cafe, with no real understanding of how the environment can improve your healing efficacy. It was more to impress.
Lobby, those restaurants make them a lot of money.
Exactly.
Let me just
Exactly.
say this too. Being a geriatrician, the environment of healthcare facilities for the that expect elderly people to be in them, and elderly people are large consumers of healthcare,
Yes.
are catastrophically designed for old people, most.
Yes.
And what's really bizarre about this is that the literature concerning this started in the 1960s. And the shape of door handles and where they should be. And you mentioned fluorescent lighting, which is dreadful for people, especially individuals with cataract. On and on and on and on and on and on. Then even worse in long-term care facilities, which are long hallways with little rooms coming off. On and on and on and on and on. Now it's the first time I became aware of this was in 1970, and let's see, 50 years ago. You know, and there, I don't want to waste time talking about it. It's not even death and dying. You were talking, I mean, when you go for chemotherapy, clearly you've got a bad disease that may wind up killing you, and you're certainly very, very anxious about that whole process. I am not surprised that but yeah, I am a little bit surprised because when you think about it, even in our hospital systems here, let's look at the two big ones, Northwestern and Rush, for example, the ones that I'm familiar with. They have rebuilt their healthcare facility during this last 50 years at least 3 times. And the technology and the ideas behind what involves a salubrious and healing environment have been known for that period of time. And yet somehow, I'm not criticizing every room in every place, but somehow it doesn't seem to get through to people. I don't know if it's a matter of an issue of money, although it doesn't seem to me that it would cost that much more to produce an environment with indirect lighting, but I don't get it. But, you know, so it's a problem, and these environments are not healthy for anybody.
I agree with you, Jack. That was a very accurate assessment.
And what's fascinating about that too is that all of us get old, we hope, right? It's better than the alternative. So why isn't there this focus of healing and community and help more often, right? It's out there. It's just, right? It's amazing to your point about how long it's taken for people to even start thinking about that.
Well,
it seems to be. Oh, sorry. It seems to me a lot less about money than about priorities. I mean, I've been reading. I don't know if anyone's read "Being Mortal" by Atul Gawande. It's a fantastic book, and it's really about care for the elderly and kind of the you know, how they might often have an emphasis on safety rather than on well-being. And he really talks about the issue of dignity. So, for example, they were talking about healthcare centers for elderly people, whether they're kind of, you know, homes or assisted living. And they were saying that there's one person who wanted to kind of introduce animals into the kind of, you know, to be with elderly people, but they weren't allowed to for certain kind of, you know, issues around safety. But when they were able to do it, the well-being of the patients kind of increased exponentially.
Of course.
So these things they're really to do with kind of different priorities, kind of thinking in different ways about what it is to be healthy.
So Alexander, I'm actually have a project. It's actually on Rogers Park. It's with Home, which is an intergenerational housing concept developed actually in the late 60s, 70s. And we have a design. They're about to begin fundraising of the lower ground floor, which was a bunch of big rooms, tables, but nothing that fostered activities. So we introduced therapeutic community building spaces, or interventions, okay, and worked with the residents and really have developed a little model, because again, it's about doing something. Healing is a verb. It's not a passive activity. And that building, that because of the design and different things, fell into this sort of, that community room was as quiet as a tomb because nobody wanted to be there really. So, there are solutions, and, we've just taken our model and adapted it to intergenerational housing where they have young families. It's about 80% senior. And then they have some 20-somethings who live for free there, and they take care of the more disabled seniors. It's amazing. It's actually amazing concept, but it needed an environmental / program rejuvenation, because the program's amazing, but it's sort of fallen, it just needs that sort of interjection of what we've just presented today. Because again,
Paul, I'm sorry you didn't encounter the Children's Hospital in Israel, because that's another good one that took healing into account. And there's nothing like Lurie, which is exceptional.
true.
But this was built maybe 25 years ago, and there's a lot of superb concepts that were used for healing children. Shoma?
Don't know it. I don't, Barbara, I don't know it. Ann Berger worked at a hospital in Tel Aviv that she described. I forgot the name of it, but I saw some pictures which were amazing. I
Then
think,
that's the Children's Hospital.
is that the Children's Hospital?
Schneider? It finally got a name.
I rushed
Okay.
home because the subject was so interesting. I drove home faster than I normally do because I'm very interested in this. So I don't know about Lurie, but there's a Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. When you walk in there, the first thing it says in there is the soul moves first. It's one of the hospitals that integrates this idea of healing from within, that Plato's concept. So I have a question. The group knows I run this online program that is about being part of something larger than ourselves. And a part of the program actually runs for homeless veterans in North Carolina. It's an online program. It's been running for a year. Thomas Gorey, who's a retired brigadier general, he oversees it. The program was reviewed and approved by Chris Neal. He's a neurosurgeon at Walter Reed. So these are people. What I would like, you mentioned somewhere, I don't know which one of you, because I was hearing it as a podcast, healing measures. Where are these healing measures? Because the program's been running for a year. We don't measure it because it runs completely online. There is not a physical space. They have a physical location in North Carolina, and it deals with empathy. It ties up that trauma is captured in mental states. So they tap it through music, through poetry, and through art. The general really likes poetry. We were testing it out for the first year. It seems to be going well. So the next step would be to measure it. Is there published healing
Yes.
measure? I think one
Yes.
of you mentioned it.
And-
How does
and-
one get that?
Ann Berger, my, again, colleague for 13 years, it's NIH Heals. Ann Berger, MD, Chief of Pain and Palliative at NIH. We could either send it to you.
Happy to send it to you.
We could send it to you.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. Oh, so sweet.
And there's also the NIH Heals, not just from Ann, they've got several measures as well that have been studied. So hers is the newest, and it's really fascinating, cutting edge work. But they have other ones that have been around for a little bit longer.
But hers was, again, we worked together at the Epidaurus think tank, and then she again works with, or on my guideline, she was one of the subject matter experts. We're also collaborating right now on what Sam described as NIH solicited me to develop a tool for opioid addiction mitigation. And now I'm collaborating with Sam. I mean, actually, they solicited us while Sam and I were collaborating, and we're going to utilize this online tool that we are currently developing. You may also want to look at another collaborator of us. It's Dry Hooch out of Milwaukee. They're a veteran peer-to-peer support group that has developed a training manual for peer-to-peer support of trauma, addiction, sexual assault. They had worked with the Medical College of Wisconsin, SAMHSA, HHS, and the VA to develop this training manual that, again, like the guideline, can be applied to anyone, who's experienced trauma. And so they have numbers. They've been deemed by SAMHSA as, this works. And then we are working on the Illinois Governor's Challenge together, which is veteran suicide prevention. That's currently sponsored by SAMHSA and the VA. And we're working with the Illinois Department of Mental Health. So this is stuff for everyone. It's not, in our society, what it's been a bit challenging, as you know, Samurai, is why we separate the veteran experience from the civilian experience so much. It's just doesn't make any sense. So 20 years of war, yes, and the after war has taught many lessons and benefits for society in general, especially in the post-pandemic era, which it's going to be very disturbing. It's going to be a very disturbing time in the next 10 years, because we are all traumatized now, and people with less resources are facing situations of incredible challenge, coming especially from the south and west sides of Chicago, where community violence has been epidemic for 40 years. And again, thank God, we have President Biden, who recognizes that healing is a national priority. We have to heal.
Penelope?
Sam, you were talking about, we were both talking about, both you and Paul, about, the waiting rooms that still look terrible. I'm wondering, and Barbara mentioned this marvelous children's hospital in Israel, and you talked about Lurie. I'm wondering if there's any pattern to those who seem to get it right in terms of what gets their attention. What is it that, part of it's money, that always helps, but it isn't enough. And some of it is thinking that it's important. I think we have a culture that sort of thinks you should deal with it. it's less inclined, it's not as community based as some other cultures are, or for all of it takes a village. But I'm wondering if there's a pattern to those who do it right that might help develop approaches to those who are about to do it to try and get their attention. It's, I always use the example of the mule tamer joke, first you've got to get their attention. What is it that gets people's attention to start doing this and to do that?
Penelope, I mean, my client at the VA, Gary Fisher, who's an architect, who launched this initiative at the Healing Environment Design Guideline at the Department of Veterans Affairs, had a vision to create this document. His father was also a US Marine in the Pacific during World War II. So it takes a combination of kind of that personal empathy, compassion, for those who you're going to serve. And then it takes imagination of not what was done before, but what could be to make it better. So that's what I found with my clients. I've had some amazing clients. We did the first standalone veteran center at any university at Texas A&M, San Antonio, and Cedar Rapids. But it took an understanding of things have to change from an individual or a small group. I can't tell you. I mean, I've had 25 years of trying to get in the city of Chicago, and I think we're in now, but I'm not sure. But they seem to indicate there's a need for healing environments.
Which also, it's funny because this is where B2B component, the business to business component comes in, where those organizations that have a very strong mission, vision, and values, and then they focus on helping their employees, because we found that happy workers are anywhere from 12 to 31% more productive. And then some hospital groups are starting to take this data and say, well, how can we start applying it in new ways where it makes sense? So some hospital groups are actually starting to, and new primary care groups are starting to tap people from hospitality to say, hey, this worked well at this hotel group. How do we bring that into sort of a concierge idea for hospitals? And how do we start focusing on, if you think about it, user experience is the new metric that matters, where those things are very, anybody can review anything online at any time. And we're reviewing doctors, we're reviewing, you can look up anybody, their health grades, and that's starting to inculcate itself into hospital groups. So it's not just to piggyback on what Paul was saying, definitely people with imagination, but then people thinking about the metrics that matter and what do we need to affect and how do we do that? Not just because of Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement and the scores that you get for recidivism and healing or not healing, right? There are insurance companies are saying, okay, you only get this number of days in the bed. And if you don't, then how does that work? And people trying to optimize that dollar. And then there are other organizations that are starting to say, well, how do I capitate that cost? And I want to keep that entire capitated cost. So for every dollar, I want to control that whole dollar, not 80 cents the dollar. So I can do an end-to-end healing solution for people and make it easier for them. So there are definitely certain groups that are starting to do that. It starts off, some people start off with, well, I want to make more money, but then they realize that if I do it the right way, doing the right thing will make me more money. And then some start with that mission, vision, and values to say, okay, this is how we're starting in the first place, and things we've noticed about people not getting better. And going for preventative care will save, it's a little bit more money up front, but it saves you so much more money in the back end. So it's kind of that there's no one right answer to say what gets their attention, because I'm fluent in Sam, I'm not necessarily fluent in Penelope. So I have to figure out, as we're starting to approach people, to see what makes the most sense, figure out where they're coming from, and make it make sense. It's funny because no matter what side you sit on, if you're Democrat or Republican, everybody wins, right? Hospital groups, people get better, and it saves costs. So Republicans would love that because it's lowering the costs of healthcare and lowering the cost of insurance and lowering all the costs of things that are driving up some of the negative parts of the economy in the wrong ways, and then Democrats love it because it's actually helping people. So,
But even I would say that even Democrats would rather spend less money for better outcomes.
absolutely.
I mean, money for all we diss money as a not a proper metric. Money is something that people across the board tend to pay attention to, and if you can convince people, or it may not occur to people, these various things. It may not occur to them that having green space, having pleasant music, it may not occur to them that this produces lower cost outcomes, that there's less recidivism, people actually leave the hospital earlier. I mean, maybe getting the attention of the insurance companies, they have a lot of
Yes.
pressure that
Yes.
they can apply to the hospitals and saying, look, you've got these outcomes that we don't like, and we see that you do this, and this, which is not positively associated with healing.
Penelope, you absolutely hit it on the head. I mean, and again, it's interesting going into these hospitals, especially this one particular one in San Diego, which I forget the name. It's in our guide. I think we should put a picture or two in our guideline. It was one of the most expensive hospitals I've ever been in for construction costs. And I just kept shaking my head, it's what a waste of money. Where I think a lot of more money has to go into, again, community programs or peer support or the park system or schools for health and well-being. I think this is really, it's creating this sort of healing infrastructure, right? And that's accessible to everyone in the neighborhood. And it focuses on preventive care. That's going to keep people out of the hospitals and the prices from rising. That, in my opinion, that's the answer. We even had a discussions with the Chicago Park District for a healing environment master plan that would utilize the park buildings and parks with little architectural healing and interventions. And that was a year before COVID, right? It got some attention and then it went away. I think that's more the answers, really.
Have you heard
Mama?
about? I was going to ask you, sir.
I'm sorry, I have a quick one because I'm very, very interested in what you said, Mr. Alt, when you started off that you had gone to Italy and that you had been to the cemetery. The one guaranteed outcome for all of us is death. Are there hospitals who have the vision to make that acceptable? Because even you have music, like I don't know if you pronounce it 4 or 4A. His Requiem is all about showing the music. That music says that death, if not a happy deliverance, it's almost like a lullaby of death. Most cultures in America, or the Western cultures, shuns death like the plague, but it's absolutely unavoidable. Are there hospital systems or healthcare providers who at least address that issue? That not everything is going to be palliative, not everything is going to be healed. There's vision there. Are there hospitals, since you deal with so many, has there one that address it?
In our guideline, we put a commemorative space. So in our design guideline for the VA, Department of Veterans Affairs, there's a section on commemorative space. You can be at the hospital getting your treatments and you can go mourn a friend.
No, accepting mourning, like some people are terminally ill. That
Well,
ability to accept
that's where they go to hospice, right? So some hospital systems have strong connections to hospice, but there's no actual spaces at civilian hospitals that I've been in that will deal with that. They want it
I have
off.
a chapel, but it's not the same thing.
It's not, and the chapels are really bad mostly, but to your point, Samaray, in civilian hospitals, there's no recognition of that. of death,
Mhm.
or
Actually,
impending death that I have seen.
Merle?
well, just as an aside to that point, separate from space, but to Shoma's point, a number of hospitals where I've visited, for instance, patients, they have clergy of different denominations who come to the room.
Mhm.
And if something is on your mind you feel would be helpful to discuss with a spiritual leader, whatever denomination, that's available, at least in Chicago, at some of the big hospitals.
Mhm.
Can I just make a digression? The focus on waiting rooms is a pet peeve of mine. And it's because for people who are seriously ill, to sit and wait for an appointment can be very stressful. And for some people, one of the components of the stress has to do with privacy. And I find it incredibly ironic that in most hospitals, when you go to the check-in desk, they give you a sheet of paper and telling you that you're entitled to this and that and this privacy thing. It's single space, 2 pages. And yet they put you in a waiting room with hundreds of people, and God knows who you might run into that you know that you might not necessarily want to know you have an illness.
It's true. So in the VA guideline, the idea is that you get a beeper. You know, you get this thing. You can go to the courtyard with the gardens. You can go to a contemplative room. Again, from our guideline, you know, I'm not saying this has been built yet because it was released in 2018. But
It's a nice idea.
yeah, so we covered that. You can go to the cafe and have a coffee, right? And that's all within the vicinity of your medical appointment. And so you're not going up, you know, 5 floors or whatever, you know. So just to make, you know, we thought very hard about that because many veterans said the same thing, Merle, as you.
This is also why concierge services are now on the rise, where you get a same day or next day appointment. And when you get there, your appointment is ready, like a real,
Yeah,
real
but
business to do.
at this stage, the concierge option is available only to people with enormous resources.
Yeah.
Actually, the challenge I'll give you is that some of them are only about $100 for a membership. So, or $200 for a yearly membership
Really?
or a subscription. Absolutely. So there's a
Okay.
company that went public last year called One Medical,
Oh, yeah.
and they they're getting more and more clinics. There's another organization on the East Coast that's starting to grow. So they're starting to do it. And to your point about it's not just for people with resources, and yet there are absolutely people without $200.
But the reality is, as we all know who have waited for appointments, there's always delay.
Not with
You
the
know.
concierge service, Paul. With the concierge service, there is no delay. That's the whole point about it.
No, but I guess, you know, just my wife's a general practitioner in Uptown. And she sees about 20 to 30 patients a day. And it just takes 1 or 2 patients, you know, with that doctor that can go way over time.
So one of the things they're doing is these concierge services, they limit the number. That's so every doctor is now an employee instead of someone who's got admitting or rights to go see patients there. And then they specifically limit the doctor to patient ratio. But
well,
that's not,
again,
that's not all.
in the ideal world. You know.
No, it's happening, right? So this is why the concierge services for subscribers are starting to increase. But to everybody's point, it's not the prevalent model in healthcare right now. Hopefully it'll change.
Shari?
I think this is fascinating. And I think so much of what you're saying is contraindicative to what's actually happening. For example, some of the hospitals have put in this hospitalist systems where your doctor has nothing to do with anything. You're admitted and then the hospitalists take over. And they're not concerned with your mental attitude or helping you through an illness. They're starting from base 1 and starting questionnaires and asking things that your doctor knows all about. So all of this time could be saved if your doctor were back in the picture. And yet Northwestern, for example, is all hospitalists, and they're dreadful people. They're killing people. And I've been right in
My
there.
husband's a hospitalist, but that's okay.
It's, but Shoma, it's
It's okay.
terrible.
It's okay. I agree. They're billed. They are timed, and they're saying how quickly can you get your thing out at the end of the year. They're
Exactly.
commissioned on that. I agree with you, but
But
he's a
it's the
hospitalist.
patient that's suffering.
They also
Well,
come
what
into
we
your
could
life when
spend-
you're the most vulnerable and
Yeah.
Exactly.
able to
We
fight
could
for
spend
yourself.
3 hours on this topic alone. I saw the adoption of this system while I was still in practice.
Mhm.
Fortunately, I left practice before it became as prevalent as it has. And it's economics, pure and simple, driven
Mhm.
by the insurance companies without actually supporting data that it actually saves money. But we don't have to. And I have to tell you, the other economic issues have to do with the construction of waiting rooms and how cost centers and hospitals are allocated for reimbursement and who's paying for it. Even though these doctors are employees of the hospitals, they're set up as individual practices, which then have to pay for space that they're using. And depending on how that space is allocated, what the costs can be. For example, one year when I was still in practice, Rush found out from its attorney, we have an attorney here, that they could legally add the square footage of the hallway outside the doctor's office to the lease costs. And suddenly, and they were charging you per square foot. And suddenly your lease cost went up because they were now charging you for square footage of hallway space outside the office. So, and they were doing this by taking money out of these practice plans. It's really quite a complicated thing that's really not, we could spend hours on this, but it's a very complicated issue. The hospitalist thing, don't get me started.
Oh, I know.
That's going to go away
I'm the
too.
same.
That is-
Urgent care is much more important now. The urgent care clinics are are affecting hospitals big time, because the other ones who are not a hospital in my Indian family, they work in the healthcare system in supply chain. And so that's where the line is. Urgent care is coming in. Doctors who own a whole set of hospital urgent cares, they want to be bought out just like the individual private practices were bought out. It's tied up with the insurance companies. Urgent cares are popping up to address these issues.
Well, their cost less
Number two.
money per
Yeah,
patient
economics.
than outpatient hospital care. The other issue is if we actually had, you heard about having healthcare, computerized healthcare records. One of the things they were supposed to do, but has failed to do so far, was connect all these level of cares across the country with one another. The problem is they're using competitive systems that don't speak to one another. And even something like my chart, which some of you are familiar with because you're Northwestern or Rush patients or whatever, doesn't actually have all the information you need to be able to see. For example, let's say you go to Northwestern, you have a CAT scan there. What the doctor at Rush can see is the report. What they can't pull up are the actual films to look at, assuming that they're still doing that. Okay, so the systems still don't work. I'm sorry, everybody, I've got to go, but this is tangential to your guys' work, but unfortunately, all of this fits together.
Thank you, Jack. That's good to
Thank
know.
you.
Yeah. So anyway, guys, this was a great talk. It's been something that it's been in my consciousness as a geriatrician dealing with frail elderly for decades. And I'm glad that there is movement. There has been movement, but that there's more movement here. And like so many things, because I worked for the VA in the last part of my career, the VA I was chief of staff at Hines VA Hospital just before I retired. So I have to say that like so many things, this socialistic healthcare systems that the Republicans would like to destroy is actually, again, at the forefront of some of these changes. Goodbye,
Jack,
everybody.
thank you so much, Jack.
Ciao, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why can't we go after this insurance companies? They're the ones that are holding everything up.
They should like a system like this to help bring costs down.
I would think so. Exactly.
And so some are looking at it. That's why they're starting to go to value-based instead of pay-per-service-based. So as the value-based systems start to go to the fore, insurance companies are absolutely supporting that because their actuarial science says that this saves them more money.
But you have to convince them that this is true. And you know, I remember reading an article, it seems to me it was in the New Yorker, about a system of having nurses proactively call people who were diabetic or who had drug issues. And it got all kinds of pushback because it seemed to be coddling. But a word I think that came into play in this seemed to be coddling these people who should take better care of themselves. But what they wound up doing, what the study did is it saved huge amounts of money because people were not going into diabetic comas. They were not winding up in the emergency room. But it comes up against a kind of, for want of a better word, morality that says you should take care of yourself and you should get the help you need. And we, the taxpayer, should not be paying for a nurse or an urgent care or whatever it is to mollycoddle you.
That sounds familiar.
Getting people's attention to say, this actually is cost effective. This will save your taxpayer dollars, or you, if you're an insurance company, this will produce better outcomes for your investors. But I don't think
one of the
connection.
One of the interesting things, and I read this years ago, so I don't know if it's up to date, but if doctors who had made a mistake were allowed by their lawyers to say, I'm sorry, it would have kept the lawsuits down, because the lawsuits in many cases were about, look at me, I deserve your attention, I deserve recompense, and a simple, I'm sorry, would have spared so many lawsuits. And yet the lawyers, hello lawyer, wouldn't allow it because it's admitting a mistake.
Yeah,
That's right. I'm not a litigator.
Yeah. Keep in the way of compassion. But again, this is why some of those or subscriber services, they're not calling themselves concierge service now. Subscriber services are starting to become more and more prevalent because they're focused on value-based care and they're taking the entire calculated dollar. And so they're focusing more and more on preventative care. So even at COVID, one of these groups, they focus on seniors, and they were telling seniors, you stay home. And they were this is their healthcare provider, was delivering them toilet paper, was delivering them goods that they needed.
Masks.
They would stay home with masks. So they would stay home and not go get COVID. But other organizations were like, oh, well, why would we do that? Like exactly to your point, Penelope, where it's not about coddling. It's about, hey, they know that all of this will serve their clients better, which makes them stay out of the hospital, which makes them stay as well.
But one of the things we have to understand about our country, it was founded by the Puritans who were escaping religious persecution wherever. That didn't make them generous souls. You know,
or compassionate.
and none of that. I mean, it was as judgmental as you can get. So our founding peoples set the standard.
You don't think that the Salem witch trials were compassionate?
No, you know, but they made for many good plays.
A lot of good things happened there. I've got something to say. Years ago, a client of mine was opening a surgical center through Northwestern at Water Tower. And I was hired to do the design. And the design was done completely for the edification of the physicians. And parenthetically, it had to do with patients. And it was all for the comfort and the efficiency of the physicians. And this is a complete turnaround. Where now we're thinking of the compassion needed for the patients involved and even the mental care of the patients involved.
But
At least something is happening.
But Shari, in the healing and design principles for the guideline, one of the principles is in fact well-being spaces for the caregivers and medical professionals.
Oh,
Again,
absolutely.
it's looking at it all together, as one
Absolutely.
ecology.
For everyone.
But
for
this was
everyone.
30,
Stan?
35 years ago that I had this job.
Yep,
So completely different then.
yep.
Sam, when Jack and David were at Northwestern concurrently, there was one place you could eat. Now, the second floor at the hospital is like food stations at major malls.
Right.
So I assume it's a profit center.
It is.
Certainly.
Although
Big.
I will say to you that if you happen to be a patient in a bed, the food is beyond, I eat everything and it was inedible. It was inedible. I ordered things like scrambled eggs. How can you screw up scrambled eggs?
Because they're
Powdered.
powdered.
But I have a question.
David loved the chicken pot pie.
I never was offered that. But Paul, you mentioned that we were in for at least 10 years of stress in the following the pandemic of people. The pandemic has clearly underscored the cost of our lack of attention to public health measures
Yes.
in general. So there were many things that could have, I mean, even absent Donald Trump, which is hard to take out of the equation, but that
Yes.
it was a problem. But I'm wondering what you all think about whether there will be positive changes to public health and to attitudes toward healing. Long COVID, it took a while for that to get people's attention, that is the medical community's attention, that people weren't malingering, that this was something genuine, that the stress that people are reporting
Yes.
following the pandemic, even if they don't have toddlers, even if they haven't lost their jobs. Do you think this is going to be a positive watershed moment? Then things are going to change?
Penelope, I can say this with cautious optimism, and I can't say exactly which school system I'm talking with now, that is interested both in the real healing environment as well as our tool, Sam's and I and Greg's tool, Sacrospace. But there is a shift because there's money to do something with. So this particular school system got $24 million over 3 years for mental health, and they don't know what to do with it. And we were approached and introduced, and all of a sudden they understood that, gee, healing environments could make a difference in these very generic schools. And I'm saying generic, I don't care if it's New Trier or, again, DeSable High School. They're still all kind of generic, except just fancier in some places. And so the fact that we're in these discussions, that they said they're going to adopt the VA guideline for this school system. And I was like, okay, we'll see. I think it's, again, it has to happen in the community, and it's not a community health center or mental health center. It's in the schools, it's in the parks, it's in places that everyone can have access. And the parks make the greatest sense because everyone can go there, right? But the damage to 11 to 17-year-olds, that they just had a report released to MHA, or God, what was the report I just sent you, Sam? It was the mental health. I mean, Face the Nation today, the last segment. But suicide ideation.
Yeah.
Mm.
amongst 11 to 17-year-olds. It's stunning. It's scary. I mean, I have a 10-year-old. I take her to Franklin Fine Arts over on off of Wells Street. It's heartbreaking to see the kids so subdued and scared. You know, they're in hybrid now.
Mhm.
This crisis is going to go beyond, 10 years. I mean, I think, but it's because we have to now. There's no choice. There's no choice. My frustrations after doing all this federal work and trying to do something locally, I was like, I don't understand, the federal government and then my other clients connected the dots. There's a serious issue of not connecting dots. Now the pandemic has forced us to, because it's not going to be for niceties or, extra little things. This is going to be out of necessity for all of us.
Mhm.
From years of sitting on boards, I eventually observed that if you don't want the answers, you don't ask the right questions.
Call from.
Hello.
That's a really good question, Penelope. It's, really hard to make any
Okay,
predictions
lovely.
because a lot of it is political, I suppose.
No, I'll come down.
Societally, how much progress
Right.
we're ready to make. And it does seem like, the platform like this is more needed in this country, but maybe more apt to be adopted in European and Asian countries before the US. We'll have to see.
Alas, I suspect it would be a partisan issue.
Uh-huh.
It's easier for me to imagine Democrats seeing, not just voting for it, but seeing the need for it. The only exceptions to that are when a Republican, this is really sounding biased, but a Republican actually has an issue like that in his or her family. It has a suicide or
Yes.
think of how things changed with attitudes toward gays when, various high-level Republicans had gay members of their family, their immediate family, and it changed the attitude of the country.
They always had them. They didn't talk about them.
But because the gay members came out in public, it was right here.
Mhm.
And that attitudes toward that, this is hopeful, Paul. Attitudes toward things like gay marriage changed faster than almost any other major social, cultural change that we've ever recorded. They just changed quickly. Maybe this will happen as well. We will see that.
But on that touch,
company,
go ahead.
and they're absolutely, one of the things they're now investing in is very quickly in technologies as well, because they realize that they hadn't been. They've been focusing on the physical space, and so now they are absolutely focused on healing in general, as well as the tech that helps wrap it together. So it's getting there, and we're going to have that focus on it.
Selma.
Money. You unmute.
Unmute.
Mr. Paul had something to say. I can wait after that.
No, but I just want to follow up just real quickly. This online tool is meant to be part of a mothership, to be the most effective. So a real healing environment or institution, okay, even if they don't have healing environments, and the technological tool or our online virtual healing environment platform, right? So it's not either or. Again, it gets back to the whole theme, hopefully, that you saw today. It's and or both. There's no either ors. So.
Penelope, I have one thing, it was very surprising to me, the work at that North Carolina VA care place, 90% Republicans. Their approach to it, you would be surprised at how liberal they are in accepting it. The general pivots on poetry, perhaps because they've served areas in Iraq. Their minds are more open to the Eastern ideas of what is treatment. but I was very surprised, very pleasantly so. So that's why I wanted to start measuring, because I'm not interested in measuring whatsoever. They're staunchly Republicans, but they are so open to most of the stuff I do is very highly Easternish. They're completely open to it. They push me more and more towards more of these Eastern acceptance of healing. Perhaps if you are traumatized enough, you'll be open to it, but they're very Republican. I was so happy. And Sherry, very interestingly, when you said, what did you say? The Salem witch trials. It's long,
Yeah.
you were talking about where it is. You know, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had written so much about it, House of Seven Gables, all of them. His grandfather was one of the judges at the Salem witch trials.
Oh,
If you
really? I
put
didn't know
that
that.
in context and you read his books now, it's
Hmm.
almost like a penance. This is what my grandfather did. I will continuously write about stuff that is entirely opposite to what he implemented. All his stories are about, you know, the underdog that he sits there. It's very interesting. If you take a long enough spectrum, these Republicans' grandkids may be the most uber liberal and accepting of ideas. It's
Good
very
point.
nice. It's
That would
really
be nice.
Yeah,
Wouldn't
it
that be nice?
And
Yes.
you know, I get the idea of tech and and I'm a former programmer. You know, tech is I'm fine with tech, and I'm profoundly annoyed right now at the University of Chicago not actually posting things to its my chart entries for a friend's thing. You know, so it takes human. But I will tell you, you know, and as you were talking about this, this came to mind. A couple of years ago, I went through treatment for breast cancer. And I remember the waiting rooms. It was Northwestern.
That was horrible.
But what I really remember best is the time that one of the women who was checking me in, you know, every time, came around the side and hugged me.
Oh,
Oh, that's nice.
No, that hugs are, I mean, this sounds very new age, but hugs are still going to be right up there as
Mhm.
But
healing.
not in the age of COVID. That's the
Well,
sad.
This was pre-COVID.
But so remember that technology is not a solution. Technology enables humans to do something different. And it's not, as Paul said, it's an and or both that we're talking about. So it's part of integrated whole person care. It's not a replacement for anything. We're still going to have to go and make those connections with people and do exactly that.
Yeah.
So it's a very good point.
Thank you so much for presenting this. This was wonderful.
Well, thanks for
Yeah.
being
thank you for coming.
Thank you all. This was fabulous. And Shoma and Sam and Paul, maybe you'll talk to one another.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I would love
And Greg can be in there to make sure nothing happens.
Great to meet you. Yes,
Yeah,
Shoma, it's
Craig,
really
you'll
weird.
make sure nobody gets sued.
Oh, yeah.
Shoma, my oldest friend lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, is thinking of joining a board of a veteran support. Are you talking about Charlotte, this organization?
This is in Raleigh.
Oh, it's in Raleigh.
In
Okay.
Raleigh, North Carolina. Thomas Gregory, he's the Brigadier General who heads that. He's the ED of that program. But
Okay.
yeah, I'll be happy to send it to you. You can look at it because it's been running well for a year. You can see what outcomes. I just want to find tested outcomes. So if they do bother to measure it, it has some benchmark accredited measures and not some hokey stuff that, oh, it feels good.
Yeah.
And
So thank you.
That'd be
everybody's
helpful.
email is on the Zoom invitation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Good.
Great. Great
Thank
meeting
you,
everybody. I
Barbara.
hope to
Thank
talk
you,
again soon.
Barbara.
I
Bye,
drove 90
all.
miles to
Have a
get
good day.
on here on time. I didn't get a ticket, so yay. Bye.
Love you
Have a nice
all.
weekend.
You.
Have a nice
Wonderful.
Bye.
weekend.
Thank you.
Yes, enjoy the weekend.
You too.
Ciao. Sammy will talk.
I'm sure.